Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. The recruiting efforts, if you're watching on YouTube, of that man in the bottom corner, Kalen Deboer. Kalen Deboer is the new head coach at Alabama. And I know that Alabama recruiting at a really high level is not really a story in the grand scheme of college football. Recruited that way forever. Nick Saban has been there. They've basically been in the mix for number one recruiting classes every single season. But at the same time, we also know how the reaction was when Kalen Deboer got the job at Alabama. Oh, he's not going to be able to recruit. Can't go to the Southeast. He's from the Pacific Northwest. He's only been at the Power 5 level as a head coach for 2 years. Washington never recruited an elite level. Producer Matt, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but I'm pretty sure at some points they started calling him Husky Harson. In other words, they said, this guy's going to be Alabama's Brian Harson. He's going to be out in 2 years. We're going to have to make up some stuff to get rid of him because he's going to stink, and we're going to send him back to the Northwest where he came from. Not saying that's where Bama fans were, but that was where about 13 other SEC fan bases were when he got hired. Well, I bring it up because a few weeks ago, we talked about this man, Kalen Deboer, and this incredible staff and this incredible recruiting class he put together because it was about 2 weeks ago, end of June. We get to the end of the June recruiting cycle, and he has a monster push. Micah Deos, number one offensive lineman in the state of Alabama, commits. Dijon Lee, a big corner, like 6'3", 6'4" cornerback from the state of California, commits. And all of a sudden you look up, Bama had the number 2 recruiting class in America, number 1 in the SEC. I think Deboes got them from 3 to 2, but you get the point. They had the guy that they said could not recruit at the highest levels about 2 weeks ago had the number 2 class in America, number 1 in the SEC. That itself is not bad. The problem for those other 15 SEC fan bases, I think I said 13 before, 15 SEC fan bases is this. While you were sitting around, while you were at the pool reading your preview magazines this weekend, Kalen Deboer and his staff got after it with not 1, but 2 5-star commitments to add to the recruiting class that he already has. So let's go ahead and get into it because right now, as I record here, Alabama, according to On3, has the number 1 recruiting class in America. And we've got an old saying here at the Aaron Torres Pod YouTube, and Aaron Torres Media. It's this. Don't doubt Deboer. Don't doubt Deboer. That's right. You can see at the bottom of our screen, AaronTorresOnline.com/merchandise. We're actually selling tees now. We sold a bunch of them over the weekend. You can see it on the screen. Don't doubt Deboer. Thank you, producer Matt. Let's get into what happened this weekend. So this weekend, like I said, you're sitting there reading your playoff or your preview magazines, not a care in the world, feet up, feet in the sand, whatever. Well, on Saturday, because I know that's what I was doing. I was at a pool on Saturday, celebrating my wife's birthday. Happy birthday, sweetheart. And I had a preview magazine in hand, and I'm reading about this school and that school and whatever. Check my phone. Caleb Cunningham, 6'1" wide receiver, number 3 wide receiver in America, according to 24/7 Sports, commits to Alabama. This was an interesting recruitment. It had been projected for weeks. He was an interesting story. Took a visit the last week of the June recruiting period. And on that visit, as soon as it was done, all the crystal balls started rolling in for him. He actually went on my buddy Ryan Fowler's show. And he told Ryan, first of all, when you're doing interviews with the local media before you even commit, there's a pretty good chance you're going to commit. But beyond that, when he did that interview with Ryan Fowler, what he said was, I was ready to commit this weekend, but I promised my family I'd go home, think it through, maybe, take some visits in the fall, but boom, mid-July, done, committed to Bama. Now, if that was all that Kalen Deboer did this weekend, that'd be a heck of a weekend. Not many schools anywhere in America are going to get a 5-star committed this entire cycle. But he wasn't done. Because on Sunday, Tai Haywood, big 6'6" offensive tackle from the state of Texas, had just taken visits to Texas A&M, Florida State, I believe, or he took 3 visits over the course of June outside of Bama. I know Florida State was one, A&M was another. And I bring it up because he committed on Sunday to the Alabama Crimson Tide. So in one 24-hour period, Kalen Deboer got 2 5-stars committed. They move up to the number 1 recruiting class in On3's rankings. They have the number 1 player rating. In other words, the average player ranking per commit is number 1 in the country according to 24/7 Sports. They have 5 5-stars according to 24/7 Sports, the most in America. And so again, just don't doubt Deboer. Now, what I would say about this whole situation is this. Listen, I'm a huge recruiting guy. We don't talk about it a ton on the show. I always say in basketball, we can talk recruiting because one player can change a program. In football, you need to stack really good player on top of really good player. And then you need to do it 2, 3, 4 years in a row to have a roster that's really built to compete with Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State and whatever. But at the same time, this is fascinating because I was told it couldn't be done. Not by this guy, not by this staff. Well, the one thing I can tell you, the one thing that I have learned doing this as long as I have done it, is that when you have a smart person in charge of your program, football, basketball, baseball, women's basketball, I'm sure tennis, golf is all the same, you can recruit and you will figure it out. And that to me, Kalen Deboer is the best example yet, but I use all different examples. Think about even in basketball, Nate Oates, and I've said this before, Nate Oates went from high school head coach to the SEC in a decade. You don't think you have to be really smart to do that? And you don't think you're going to figure it out once you get there? Pretty sure you'll be able to figure it. If you go from Romulus High School to Tuscaloosa, Alabama in a decade, you know what you're doing. Also, and by the way, that applies all sorts of different things. And so when it comes to Kalen Deboer, I was never worried because he was going to figure it out. By the way, you know how I knew he was built for the SEC? Because we've talked about this before. When he got on the flight from Seattle to Tuscaloosa, there was only one coach with him. There's only one coach with him. It was Courtney Morgan, his player personnel guy. It wasn't his offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, who sort of followed him in Tuscaloosa, left after a week for Seattle, back to go to Seattle. Wasn't a defensive coordinator, wasn't a line. It was his player personnel guy. And so Courtney Morgan is the guy spearheading this thing. That guy's got connections everywhere. By the way, he's like a cult hero in the state of Alabama right now, at least for Alabama fans. They added Aaron Hodges to the staff, one of the best recruiting staff members in America. We've talked about him everywhere he goes. They sign top classes or the best class in school history. And so I just bring it up to say I always knew he was going to figure it out. Now, the more interesting thing to me, are we sure they're done? And just how good is this class going to get? Because I know what people will say the opposite. They'll say, oh, it's going to fall. These guys aren't all going to make it till National Signing Day. And what I always say to that, go through the history books. There might be a player who decommits one way or the other. Might be committed to Florida State or Miami, ends up at Alabama. Might be committed to Alabama, ends up at Florida State and Miami. But for the most part, when guys commit early, unless there is a coaching change like at Texas A&M last year, or the season goes completely sideways, everything falls apart, it's colossal disaster like Florida last year, which at one point had the number 3 class and lost 4 or 5 impact guys, generally, you don't lose big volumes of guys once they commit. That's a myth. It's simply not true. Could you lose a guy or 2? Yes. But you don't lose 8 blue chip guys unless the coach changes. And so that's a myth. And the other thing I keep going back to with Deboer is I don't think he's done. They're in the mix for a bunch of other big name players. Derek Meadows, an elite wide receiver, a couple other guys on the defensive side of the ball. But here's what I keep thinking with Kalen Deboer. Because I keep hearing, first I heard he couldn't recruit. But then I hear, well, if Alabama goes 9-3, the fan base is, first of all, the fan base isn't going to turn. They love him. They know that, to use a quote from his old boss, this is a process. But two, and I think this is important as well. This to me is important, is that everybody's talking about the worst case scenario. What if they lose all these games? What if they finish 8-4 and miss the playoff? What about the opposite? What if they actually exceed expectations and are better than anybody thinks? Like, nobody talks about that scenario. Like, they played Georgia in week 4 at home. I think it's the last weekend of September. Like, what if they beat Georgia? You don't think that's going to have an uptick in recruiting? By the way, they play at LSU, at Tennessee, at Oklahoma. Those are hard games. I'm not saying they aren't. But you know what Oklahoma, Tennessee, and LSU have in common? They're all starting a first-year starter at quarterback. Nico Imamalieva has started one game in his career. Garrett Nussmeier started a lot of reps, but not a lot of game experience. Jackson Arnold started one game. It was a big L. Jalen Milroe's experienced. Jalen Milroe is one of the most experienced quarterbacks in the SEC. So I don't mean to go on and on. But this notion of it's going to fall apart, it's not. And if anything, I think it could look even better than it does right now, as opposed to it being worse. And I think, again, everybody focuses on the quote-unquote negative. What if it goes bad? What if it's a disaster? And yeah, what if it isn't?